Welcome to the store. Don't forget to subscribe, and support me.
The city of Lorthos had long forgotten the warmth of the sun. Beneath the endless shroud of darkness, its streets were cold, slick with rain and despair. Shadows lurked in every corner, watching, waiting. For over a century, the Dark Lord Malekith ruled from the highest tower of the city, his power absolute, his tyranny unquestioned. The people of Lorthos had once been proud, full of life, but now they were broken, cowed by fear, and resigned to their fate. Alan moved silently through the narrow alleyways, his hood drawn low, obscuring his face from the ever-vigilant eyes of the dark enforcers. He had fought these creatures for years, in the wilds beyond the city walls, hunting down the lesser demons that prowled the outskirts of Malekith's domain. But now, it was time to bring the fight to the heart of the darkness. Time to reclaim the city. He crouched beside a crumbling stone wall, scanning the square ahead. It was eerily quiet, save for the occasional drip of water from the rooftops. His fingers tightened around the hilt of his sword. Behind him, a small group of citizens waited, huddled in the shadows. They were a ragtag bunch, untrained, unarmed, and terrified, but they were all he had. And they were all that stood between Lorthos and eternal night. "Are we really doing this?" whispered Tomas, the blacksmith. His broad frame trembled slightly, though he tried to hide it. "We're just common folk. We're not soldiers." Alan glanced over his shoulder, his sharp blue eyes catching the faint light of the street lamps. "You don't have to be soldiers. You just have to believe that we can win." Mira, the healer, her face streaked with dirt but her eyes bright with determination, nodded. "I believe," she said quietly. "We've lived in fear long enough. If we die here, at least we'll die fighting." The others murmured in agreement, though fear still clung to their voices like the shadows to the city. Alan stood, drawing his blade. "Stay low. Follow my lead." With a final glance at the group, he stepped out into the open, his footsteps silent on the cobblestones. The square stretched out before them, a wide expanse of desolation, once a market bustling with life, now empty and desolate. Dark enforcers patrolled the perimeter, their eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. Demonic creatures, humanoid in form but twisted by Malekith's dark magic, their movements unnaturally fluid, their presence a constant reminder of the city's oppression. Alan led the group toward the shadows of a nearby building, moving quickly but carefully. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of their task pressing down on him. This was the first strike, a small act of rebellion in a city that had forgotten how to fight back. But it was only the beginning. "Over here," he whispered, beckoning the others to follow him into the cover of an abandoned shop. The door creaked as they pushed inside, and Mira quickly moved to secure it behind them. "We're safe for now," Alan said, sheathing his sword. "But we won't stay that way for long. Malekith's forces will be looking for any sign of rebellion. We need to act quickly." Tomas leaned against the wall, wiping the sweat from his brow. "What's the plan?" "We can't just keep running." "We won't," Alan replied. "We're going to start dismantling Malekith's control piece by piece. Tonight, we cut off their supply lines. We cripple their resources, make it harder for them to maintain their grip on the city. It'll take time, but we'll wear them down." Mira stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "And then?" Alan met her gaze. "Then, we take the fight to Malekith himself." For the next few nights, they struck like shadows in the night, sabotaging the Dark Force's supply routes, freeing captives from Malekith's dungeons, and spreading whispers of rebellion through the slums. Each small victory bolstered their spirits, and as word spread of their deeds, more citizens came forward to join the cause. Slowly, the resistance grew. The people of Lorthos, long silenced by fear, began to find their voices again, but Malekith was not blind. He knew something was stirring in the shadows of his city, and he was not a lord to be trifled with. One night, as Alan and his group returned from a successful raid, they found the city streets eerily deserted. No enforcers patrolled the square, no citizens whispered in the shadows. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath. "This doesn't feel right," Tomas muttered, gripping the handle of his hammer. "Where is everyone?" Alan narrowed his eyes, scanning the rooftops. "It's a trap," he said softly, drawing his sword. "Stay close." As they moved cautiously through the square, the sound of footsteps echoed from all directions. Dark enforcers, their eyes burning with malevolent light, emerged from the alleys, surrounding the group. At their head was one of Malekith's elite, a shadow enforcer, larger and more powerful than the rest, its body wreathed in black flame. "You've been causing quite a stir," the creature hissed, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. "But your rebellion ends here." Alan raised his sword, stepping forward to face the creature. "It's only just begun." The battle that followed was swift and brutal. Alan fought with the precision of a seasoned warrior, his blade cutting through the darkness with deadly accuracy. Tomas and the others held their own as best they could, but they were outnumbered, outmatched. One by one, the resistance fighters fell, overwhelmed by the sheer power of Malekith's forces. Mira cried out as she was struck down, her body crumpling to the ground. Tomas fought valiantly, but even his strength was no match for the shadow enforcer. Alan, bloodied and bruised, stood alone in the center of the square, surrounded by the fallen. The shadow enforcer approached, its fiery eyes locked on Alan. "You cannot win," it sneered, raising its sword for the killing blow. "Malekith's darkness will consume everything." But even as the blade descended, Alan moved. With a swift, desperate strike, he drove his sword through the creature's heart, shattering the dark magic that held it together. The shadow enforcer screamed, its body dissolving into ash as it crumbled to the ground. Breathing heavily, Alan fell to his knees beside Mira, his hands trembling as he reached for her. She was still alive, but barely. "Mira," he whispered, his voice breaking. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with pain. Did we win?" Alan swallowed hard, his heart heavy with the weight of their losses. "Not yet. But we will." In the days that followed, Alan and the remaining resistance fighters retreated to the safety of the catacombs beneath the city. They had lost much, but they were not defeated. Not yet. Alan knew that they could not keep fighting Malekith's forces head-on. They needed something more. Something that would tip the scales in their favor. It was then that he remembered the legend of the Heart of the Dawn, a powerful artifact said to have the ability to bring light to the darkest places. It was a long shot, but if the legends were true, it could be their only hope of defeating Malekith once and for all. Alan sat in the damp, cold silence of the catacombs, his mind racing. The resistance had suffered heavy losses, but they weren't done yet. His thoughts drifted to the Heart of the Dawn. It was more than a legend, he was sure of it. The stories had been passed down for generations, a source of pure light, hidden deep beneath the city, capable of breaking the darkest of spells. If the heart existed, it could end Malekith's reign of terror. But retrieving it wouldn't be easy. Tomas sat beside him, staring at the flickering torchlight. "What now?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the strain of battle. Alan didn't respond immediately, his eyes fixed on the shadows that danced along the stone walls. "There's something we need to find," he said after a long pause. The heart of the dawn. It's buried beneath the city, in the old catacombs. If we find it, we have a chance to end this. Mira, still weak from her injuries but sitting up, looked at him with a faint glimmer of hope. You think it's real? Alan nodded. It has to be. They didn't have the luxury of doubting legends now. The enemy was closing in, and the city itself was dying. The streets were filled with nothing but fear and whispers. If they didn't act soon, the resistance would be crushed under the weight of Malekitha's power. The heart of the dawn was their only hope. The small group moved deeper into the catacombs, navigating the twisting, ancient tunnels that snaked beneath the city. The walls were lined with bones of long-dead ancestors, the air thick with the musty scent of decay. Alan led the way, his torch casting long shadows as they ventured further into the darkness. He had studied the old maps, the ones that hinted at the location of the heart, but they were incomplete, worn from time. Mira limped alongside him, her face pale but determined. What if it's a trap? She asked quietly. What if Malekith knows about this place? He may know, Alan admitted, but he's arrogant. He believes no one is brave enough to seek the heart. That gives us the advantage. They pressed on, their footsteps echoing in the narrow corridors. The deeper they went, the colder it became, as if the very air was laced with the remnants of some ancient evil. Tomas grunted as he hoisted his hammer, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. It wasn't long before they reached a wide, open chamber, a forgotten part of the city's ancient past. In the center stood a massive stone altar, and at its heart, a glowing orb pulsed faintly with light. The heart of the dawn. Even from a distance, its energy hummed in the air, a promise of power and hope. But as they approached, the ground began to tremble. Alan's heart raced as the shadows along the walls came to life. Dark figures emerged from the gloom, ancient guardians, twisted by the magic that had sealed the heart away. They moved with unnatural speed, their eyes glowing with malice as they closed in on the group. Get ready! Alan shouted, drawing his sword. The battle erupted in a flash of steel and shadow. Tomas swung his hammer, smashing through the dark forms, while Mira, weakened as she was, fought with a small dagger, her movements swift and precise. Alan slashed through the creatures, his sword blazing with the light of the torch as he drove back the advancing horde. But for every guardian they felled, more rose from the shadows, their numbers seemingly endless. Alan's arms ached from the effort, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The guardians were relentless, and the group was being pushed back, inch by inch, toward the altar. Alan knew they couldn't hold them off much longer. He glanced at the heart, its light flickering like a dying flame. There was only one way to end this. Cover me, he shouted, sprinting toward the altar. Tomas and Mira fought with renewed desperation, holding off the advancing guardians as Alan reached the heart. He could feel its warmth radiating through the stone, a pulse of energy that seemed to resonate with his very soul. Without hesitation, he placed his hands on the orb, the light flooding through him like fire. The guardians let out a collective shriek, their forms dissolving into smoke as the heart's power surged through the chamber. Alan gritted his teeth, his body shaking from the force of the energy coursing through him. It was overwhelming, but he held on, drawing the light into himself, channeling its power. With a final cry, the light exploded outward, filling the chamber with blinding radiance. The shadows fled before it, the darkness retreating as the heart's power shattered the curse that had plagued the city for so long. When the light finally dimmed, the chamber was silent. The guardians were gone, their forms erased from existence. Alan stood at the altar, his hands trembling, the heart still glowing faintly beneath his touch. Mira and Tomas approached cautiously, their faces filled with awe. "You did it," Tomas breathed, his voice barely more than a whisper. Alan nodded, his body aching from the strain. "We're not done yet. We still have to take this to Malekith." They made their way back through the catacombs, the heart's light guiding them through the darkness. By the time they emerged into the city streets, dawn was breaking on the horizon, the first sunrise Lorthos had seen in over a century. The citizens, weary and beaten, emerged from their homes, blinking in disbelief as the sun's rays touched their faces for the first time in generations, but the battle wasn't over. Malekith's stronghold loomed in the distance, a dark spire that cast a long shadow over the city. Alan knew the final confrontation awaited them there. As they approached the fortress, the streets were eerily silent. The dark enforcers had withdrawn, no doubt regrouping within the walls of Malekith's citadel. Alan led the way, the heart of the dawn held tightly in his hand, its light casting long shadows as they made their way to the gates. Malekith was waiting for them. The Dark Lord stood at the top of the fortress steps, his black robes billowing in the wind. His eyes, burning with cold fire, locked onto Alan as he approached. "So, you've come to die," Malekith sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "You think that trinket will save you?" Alan stepped forward, unafraid. "It's not a trinket. It's the end of your reign." Malekith's laughter echoed through the streets, a sound filled with ancient evil. "You're nothing. A worm playing at rebellion. I have ruled this city for centuries. Do you think you can end that with a spark of light?" Without waiting for a response, Malekith raised his hands, dark magic crackling in the air around him. The ground shook as tendrils of shadow erupted from the earth, twisting toward Alan like the grasping hands of death. But Alan was ready. He raised the heart of the dawn high, its light blazing to life once more. The shadows recoiled, hissing as they were driven back by the sheer power of the heart's light. Malekith's face twisted in fury as the light began to spread, pushing back the darkness that had held the city in its grip for so long. "You will not win." Malekith roared, his voice shaking with rage as he unleashed a torrent of dark energy, but Alan stood firm. The light of the heart surged through him, filling him with a power greater than any darkness. With a final, desperate effort, he channeled the full force of the heart's energy, unleashing a blinding wave of light that tore through the fortress, shattering the dark magic that had bound the city for so long. Malekith screamed as the light consumed him, his body dissolving into ash as the darkness was banished once and for all. The fortress crumbled, the shadows fleeing before the dawn's light as the sun rose high above the city, bathing Lorthos in warmth and hope. Alan stood in the ruins of the fortress, his body weary but his spirit unbroken. The people of Lorthos gathered around him, their faces filled with wonder and gratitude. For the first time in generations, the city was free. Mira stepped forward, her eyes shining with tears. "You did it," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "We did it," Alan corrected, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "The city is free because of all of us." Tomas clapped a hand on Alan's shoulder, his usual gruff demeanor softened by the weight of the moment. "You're a damn hero, Alan." Alan shook his head, looking out over the city as the sun climbed higher into the sky. "I'm just a man. But now, the people of Lorthos can be heroes too." As the city basked in the first rays of sunlight in over a century, Alan knew that the battle had been hard fought, and the cost had been high. But in the end, they had won not just a city, but their freedom, their hope, and the light of a new dawn.